What's going on, y'all? It's your boy Cool Colas here, and you are now tuning into a new video on my channel. For today's topic, I'm going to be talking about something that you all voted on, and now I'm delivering. Today, I'm going to be talking about who the real villain is of the television show, The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. So let's get into it. Before I go into detail about who I believe is the villain of this series, I want to just say a few things as disclaimers. The first thing that I want to say is that I understand that with this being a TV show, there are different seasons. And typically, if a TV show is airing, each season will have a certain villain for that season. But I also understand that Fresh Prince has a certain level of continuity while also being a little bit randomized in the way that certain episodes go. With that being said, it's not always clear cut that there is even a villain whatsoever in each season. With that being said, what we're going to look at is what I believe my criteria is to determine who the real villain is of these TV shows and movies, and that's who is the individual that causes most of the problems in this show. I also understand that with stating my analysis, there will be times where I'll have to make some assumptions because the writing was questionable and there's some gaps that weren't filled in. The other thing to consider here, as I said earlier, is the fact that with Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, there is a level of continuity, but there's also moments where things are kind of just randomly done to further the story. And then you may have certain episodes that don't change up or don't progress the story that we've seen overall. We may see certain characters that are recurring. We may see certain themes that are recurring or certain issues that may have happened in the last few episodes that are continuing on, or they may have continued throughout the entire season. My point in saying this is the specific topic that I'm going to be talking about today is something where in some cases I may have to fill in some gaps by just using a bit of common sense to kind of see what could have happened there. But regardless, it will be sensible enough that you understand why I came to the conclusion that I came to. Those of us who watched The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air all the way through can pretty much come to an agreement that the villain they were trying to portray, if we had to name a villain of this series, was Lou Smith, which was Will Smith's father in this series. And most of us are in the agreement that he's the villain because of the fact that he left Will and he seemed to not be accountable for his actions. He makes a bunch of excuses. And then on top of that too, he's the person who caused the issues for Will that we can see in our faces. So in other words, he is the person who left Will's life, forcing his mother to raise him on his own, to the point where she realized she could not do a good enough job of raising him, especially in Philadelphia, where he was getting into trouble and having a bunch of fights and all this other stuff. So she had to send him away to Bel-Air so that he would have a better life. But this would not have been a thing had Lou been present or married to Vi and they had been together to raise Will. And I'm here to tell you that Lou Smith is not the real villain of this television series. The real villain of this series in 3, 2, 1 is actually Vi Smith, which is Will's mother. And we're going to get all into why she is the villain. Before I get into the explanation as to why Vi is the real villain of this television series, I want to just give a quick definition of something that I had mentioned in previous videos when I talked about similar topics to what we're talking about right now. So for those of you all who do not know, I use a term called Shea Butter Mama, or in some cases, I may use the term Blue Magic Mama. Either one suffices for what I'm trying to describe. A Shea Butter Mama or a Blue Magic Mama is a black mother, and she may not always be a single mother, but most of the time she's a single mother, and they rarely to never get held accountable for their actions. If anything, their actions are usually justified, and they usually try to wrap what they're saying in some type of inspirational quote or some type of life lesson to make it seem like what they did made a lot of sense, or it can be excused because it was for this reason or for that reason. Whereas another character, typically a male character, is not excused for having an equally, as they would believe, justified reason for why they did what they did. And in this case, we can see that with Vi's character. And as you're listening to this, I do not want to hear y'all whining about how I didn't give the full definition of a shea butter mama. I'm just giving you a refresher of what I'm describing by saying this. So there may be times while I'm talking here where I'll say, well, she has this quality too and that quality too. So that wasn't an end all be all definition. It was to give you an idea and an understanding of what that will look like and what that is. So don't whine in the comments about how I'm contradicting myself or not giving a full definition, because I really don't want to hear it. And for those of you all who are really, truly curious about the full definition of what a shea butter mama or a blue magic mama is, you can refer back to my video that I did a while back called The Psychology of the Shea Butter Mama Trope, the unaccountable OG black baby mama. The biggest problem with Vi Smith's character is that she has 5 qualities that are persistent throughout this series that show she is the villain of the series. Number 1, she's very manipulative. Number 2, she's hypocritical. Number 3, she is a poor decision maker. Number 4, she often sabotages the successes of her son. And number 5, she is very selfish. So as you know, the reason why Will Smith went to go live with his aunt and uncle in Bel Air is because Vi sent him away because of the fact that he was getting into trouble while he was there in Philly. But there's some things that we need to kind of look at with that whole situation and how there are times where it's contradicted, and there's also times where we can see one of the 5 things that I just named about Vi Smith show up. So the first thing that I want to refer to is episode 12 of season 1, which was called Talking Turkey. So in this episode, after Will went to go live with his aunt and his uncle and all this other stuff, she goes to Bel Air to visit and see Will, and then also see her sister as well too. And throughout this episode, she would constantly criticize and nitpick at the way that Aunt Viv was parenting. And she would talk about how, you know, she was spoiling the kids and she wasn't teaching them responsibility. And Will had a lot of responsibilities when he was living with her and all this other stuff. So she was basically talking about that and how, well, she raised Aunt Viv. So that means that she should have understood the importance and the value of responsibility at the end of the day. So I look back and then I had to really think about this scene, because the message that they were trying to push was that these kids were indeed spoiled and Aunt Viv was not doing a good job of balancing them having responsibility while also being, you know, able to enjoy some of the benefits that they were able to basically get their kids because of the successes that they had. While there's some truth to her argument, here's the problem. This is where some of the hypocrisy comes in. From my perspective, if Vi had all of the answers, then Will would not have needed to go to Bel Air in the first damn place. My feeling is, if she was someone who knew what she was doing and she raised Aunt Viv herself to be so great and to be able to have this great family and all this other stuff, then she should have been able to do even better than what Aunt Viv was doing. Yet she didn't have a husband. Hell, she didn't have a man whatsoever. She was living by herself. And I mean, she was doing so terrible with raising Will that she had to send him away to his aunt and his uncle. But then to later turn around, go to Bel Air and then observe the way the kids are behaving and their level of spoiledness and all this other stuff. And you couldn't even raise one son without needing some type of help, assistance, or just giving him away to somebody else. And you want to criticize somebody else's parenting work. Hell, she couldn't even financially provide for Will because she was the one who was trying to sit him down and talk about how he needed to move back to Philly because of the fact that she wasn't going to be able to pay for college out of state and all this other stuff. So she didn't even have that together. So it's funny how she was browbeating a woman who was established and married versus her being a single mother who had a lot of mouth cash, but not a lot of real cash. Next, I want to move to season 2, episode 21, which was called Vying for Attention. Now, this was the episode where Vi came to visit Will in Bel Air. And she came with her boo, Robert, and then his daughter, Claudia. So this episode was interesting because what it showed was that Will was actually jealous of the fact that his mom got a boyfriend. And that's the main thing that they wanted you to see when it came to the dynamic between him and his mother and how it was changing. They wanted you to see that Will was a brat. He was somebody who couldn't get past the fact that her dynamic was changing and all this other stuff. So they wanted you to know that Will was the person who was mostly at fault here. But they did not show the fault of Vi. Now, there was one time where they made Vi stop and pay attention, but she still was at fault a lot more than what they were trying to portray. And this goes back to what I said about the Shea Butter Mama. Oftentimes when she has wrongdoings or there are things that she does that are out of pocket, they either glaze over it or they just don't make it seem like it's a thing whatsoever. So let's get into that. So when it comes to Vi Smith and when she was in Bel Air, she neglected Will while she was there. She didn't really hang out with him. She didn't really do stuff with him, although that's her son who she sent to Bel Air to be raised. All this time had went by and she had not been able to see him, yet when she got there, she spent most of her time with Robert and Claudia and trying to get all these things done and popping. And she spent so much time hyping Robert up to the family that Will didn't really get a chance to actually spend time with her. And she also didn't really seem to include him in all of the stuff that was going on as well too, because she was so wrapped up in her world. Her thing was Robert has this construction job and he's trying to get that money, and Robert has this contract coming up where he could get some government funding and he could have his own business, and they were waiting on this call and all this other stuff. So they were focusing so much on Vi and how much she was just engrossed in Robert, but also it focused on the idea that she was just totally neglecting Will. This is a theory of mine, but this is something that I got from this. This almost kind of reminds me of Baby Boy to a certain extent, but not as toxic and not as dramatic. In other words, there are these situations where you have a mother, and this is a habit of the Shea Butter Mama, by the way. What they'll do is they'll have a son at the home because they do not have a man, and the son almost assumes the role of the man. And then mentally, they start taking on some of the emotions and responsibilities and all these other things that a man typically would have had that was intimately involved with this woman. And they project that onto their mother because of the way that she raised them and the dynamic that she created in her household. So we saw this in Baby Boy quite a bit because you saw Tyrese's character, Jody, who was very jealous of Melvin when he got in his mama's life and all this other stuff. And then you had this idea that she wanted him to leave the nest. So she was perfectly okay with Jody being there when it was just her and him. But then when Melvin got there, she was trying her best to get him out the crib. I have a theory that this similar thing was also going on with Will and his mom as well too, because as soon as she got Robert, it seems as though she wasn't really interested in bringing Will back in, because the big difference between Jody and Will in this instance was Jody was a grown man because Jody was 20 years old and Will Smith was still a boy. So it was almost as if she was now neglecting a child to start a new life. And it's weird because that's the typical trait of somebody who is a quote unquote deadbeat father who will try to start a new life after they done fucked up with their first child and didn't really, raise them and all this other stuff. But she kind of took on that role to a certain extent as well. So there was a mix of these two things going on. And throughout this episode, it was clear that she was doing everything with Robert. It was Robert. And Will was feeling neglected, but again, it was showing up as jealousy. But you could see that when they actually sat down, they had a talk, and he told her that he felt like she had moved on without him and all this other stuff. The other thing to kind of consider here was she would have continued to neglect Will and his needs, and the fact that she literally was only going to be in Bel Air for a short amount of time and not really spend time with her son like that, or her son and her quote unquote new family. And she had to be brought back to the idea that you may want to focus on Will when Carlton spoke up, because Carlton said, well, why don't you cook Will's favorite meal, is what he said, because it's not every day that he gets a home cooked meal from his mother. So as soon as Carlton said that, that's when she finally paid attention. But had Carlton not been sitting in that chair, Vi wouldn't have thought anything about that because she was, again, so engrossed in her. This showed that Vi was trying to move on and have a life without Will and not wanting to bring him back into her world. And she was cool with him basically being there in Bel-Air because now she had a man and she was spending all this time with him and all this other stuff. So she didn't really have a big need to have Will back in the picture. So this goes back to my argument that I made about what was happening with Baby Boy. So we can maybe call this the Baby Boy effect, where she was using her son as a replacement man, but because she actually ended up getting a man, she gives the son the boot, because this is exactly what happened with Juanita and Jody. As soon as Melvin got in the house, she wanted Jody out of the house despite the fact that he wasn't doing anything. And another big distinction between them two, by the way, was the fact that Jody wasn't doing anything in the house, right? But Will, from what we saw in episode 12, season 1, where that was called Talking Turkey. One of the things she talked about was how she had Will, doing a lot of different responsibilities. She had him cleaning up the house and taking care of things and whatnot. So it's clear that he actually had a lot of responsibilities and duties and things to actually take care of while he was living with Vi, which was an asset to her at that time. Now let's move to one of the most crucial episodes that I didn't realize was as crucial, because I did this topic, by the way, on a different channel of mine, the Pro Black Blurred Kingdom podcast, but I didn't talk about this specifically because it's so important. Look at season 3, episode 13, which was called Mommy Nearest. Now, this episode was important because it highlighted most of the things that I said that Vi is. Her being selfish, her being manipulative, her being hypocritical, her being a poor decision maker, and her also being someone who was sabotaging the success of her son. Matter of fact, in this episode, this was one of the only ones that she did all 5 of the things that I had just named. And this was the episode where she came to visit in Bel-Air once again. And when she visited this time, she was asked by her sisters, because her sisters were all there as well too, what happened to Robert, who was a part of her life back in season 2, episode 21. And her response was that it didn't work out between her and Robert. What's interesting about them not working out, or more interesting, is the reason why that they didn't work out. And what she told her sisters was that they didn't work out because he wanted more with the relationship and she wasn't ready for that. So this is what I mean by poor decision making. You had a man, a black man who was confident, kind, wanted your son to like him even when he was trying to push him away, and also seemed to love you a lot and wanted to have a serious relationship and commitment with you, and you pushed him away because he was too serious. Yet you just gave a big speech to Will about the fact that this was an important thing for you because you have to have a life too. You get lonely. You need companionship. You need somebody who is going to be there with you. And you get rid of him because he literally wants to give you all of the things that you just whine to Will about. And also too, while he was present, he could have actually been a present figure in Will's life if you would have brought Will back to Philly. Because if he was getting into trouble, a good chunk of the reason why he was getting into trouble is most likely, and this is where we have to make assumptions, that he didn't have a male influence who could guide him and give him pointers on how to change the trajectory of his life. And he seemed to, again, take a liking to Will, despite the fact that Will was trying to push him away and Will wasn't all that kind to him. It was even revealed that Robert was going to give Will a car. So you can see the type of man that he was. And one thing that I noticed is that when she gave her reason as to why her and Robert didn't work out, they just glazed over it. They didn't really go into detail. They didn't ask her, why she would do that or any of this other stuff, like what made you not want a serious commitment or whatever. Even Will didn't really question her about that either. And it was clear that at the end of that episode, he had made peace with the fact that his mama had found a new boo who she was taking seriously, only to find out later that she wasn't really taking him seriously and he was too serious, which again presents that whole hypocrisy argument that I had talked about. Now, what's interesting about that is they also tried to kind of glaze over it as well too, as they typically do whenever you watch these different movies or television shows. And they kind of pointed the attention that Will didn't really like him anyway. But that's interesting because it seemed that in that last episode where they showed this dynamic, Will had made peace with it. So Vi now was trying to pawn off her rationale on Will to some extent. So this is what I mean by there's a level of selfishness here, because here's what happened afterwards. Vi basically was telling Will that one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is because I wanted to talk about you coming back to Philly and basically being with me, being around me, and us kind of hanging out and doing our thing, because that's what I want now. The reason why I say this is selfish is because she was perfectly fine with Will being away in Bel Air until Robert left, or until she made the decision in her mind that Robert needed to leave. Now, this is manipulative as well too, because she's now turning Will's world upside down. She's basically saying, well, it's going to be convenient for me. It's also bringing in the selfish part as well too, for you to come and be around me, because this was always the plan. It was never supposed to be a permanent thing for you to actually be there in Bel Air, although you have now established friends, you've made connections, you've had a closer bond with your cousins and all this other stuff. So now this kind of somewhat goes into the idea that she was now sabotaging the success of her son. Her son had found a way to find a more polished and safer and more healthy life being in Bel Air. And now you were trying to make him go all the way back to Philly because you were lonely. But the initial reason why you sent him away is because it was dangerous. The danger in Philly ain't changed. So what changed about you besides the fact that you no longer have a man, unless you wanted Will to be that replacement, as I said earlier. And this is a common trait of shea butter mamas. And some people may attempt to make the argument that, well, maybe she became more financially endowed, she got a better job, she got her stuff more together or whatever. But I don't buy that either. And the reason why I don't buy that is because when Will finally told his mother that he wasn't interested in going back to Philly because he had built a life while being in Bel Air, she said, well, what are you going to do? Because here's the thing, I can't afford out-of-state college, so that's why you have to come back to Philly. So clearly her stuff wasn't together. She was in a very similar situation than what she was in before. So that's why I said this once again goes back to the fact that she only wanted Will back because of the fact that she was lonely and she no longer had Robert. And she no longer had Robert, not just intimately, but also in financial support as well too, because it was clear that at a certain point they were living together and they were, as Claudia, the daughter, said, crazy about each other. And think about that as well too. You didn't want a serious commitment, but you allowed him to get wrapped up in you to the point where he wanted to be married to you. You got engaged and all this other stuff. And now you're also severing the connection that you made with Claudia. So this was a young girl. This was his daughter. And that's the thing. This was a man who literally was putting himself back out there because of the fact that, he was divorced and he had not dated or did anything with any other woman up until he actually got with Vi, only for her to reject the proposal because he wanted something serious and she didn't. Yet she made it a serious deal when she was with Will, that this was somebody who was going to be a part of her life and he needed to just accept it and he didn't have a choice in the matter, only for her to literally throw it away because she ain't ready. Now, the last few episodes that I'm going to mention show where Vi was mostly sabotaging the success of her son. Now, I could maybe make the conjecture that some of this was out of spite, although I'm not entirely sure that that was the deal. This may just be another representation or resurface of the other issues that Vi has and how they come into effect with everything that I'm talking about. But the reason why I'm bringing that up is because in the last few episodes, I noticed, or the last few appearances that she made, I noticed that she was sabotaging Will's success at times where it was extra unnecessary. And that's why I said that it's hard to determine whether or not this was on purpose or this was an accident. And then that also goes into the argument that I made before, which is that some of this is story writing as well too. So we're going to have to infer a few things in order to really make sense of what happened there. In episode 19 of season 4, which was called You'd Better Shop Around, this was an episode where Will had become a car salesman. So he had dropped out of school and he became a car salesman. He was very successful. He was doing really well at selling all these different cars and all this other stuff, which he believed that he found a niche, a job, a career that was good for himself. Uncle Phil was not happy with it because his thing was he wanted Will to finish college. But that's interesting because Will going to college only means that he would bring in debt and he would have to go and then get a job once he finished college, because that's basically what school has been made to be at this point. Get a degree so that you can get a job and live the American dream. Now, some could say that maybe it was paid for by Uncle Phil, or maybe Vi finally came into some money and things just worked out. But I don't know if I would make any of those assumptions per se. Either way, the point is that he had already had a job where he was probably making great commissions, and it looked like he was going to be in management and all these other things were going on. And he was doing really well with the business and he was getting hired up very fast. And what does Vi do? She flies all the way from Philly to Bel Air to pull him up out of the job and antagonize the brother who was running this car business, which is ridiculous because Will was, as he said to Uncle Phil, in a nice suit, selling fine cars, making money and doing something that was productive and constructive to society. He didn't say it like that, but the point that I'm trying to make is that he was showing that he was doing something that was actually constructive with his life. And here Vi was trying to pull him out just because he had to have the accolade of finishing college, which meant that he was now going to get debt so that he could go back and redo this process, get a job while having a degree and then paying that off. Now, obviously, the cost of school probably weren't the same at that time as they are now, or when I was growing up and when I was going to school, going to college, that is, which was at this point a decade or more ago. But the point that I'm trying to emphasize here was that she literally stopped Will from doing a career that he clearly was good at. Will has always had charisma. Will has always had the chops. He always had the ability to say things on the fly. He was good with his words. He had a way with words. And it was clear that being a car salesman was something that fit his personality type. But she pulled him out of that just because she wanted to prove that her boy went to school so she could cry and see him graduate like a lot of parents do. They don't care about the tangibles of what happens later, or tangibles period, because that's why they don't do shit for their kids but send them to college anyway. And she didn't care about what happened after that because it was going to be up to him to figure it out. But here's the thing. He had already figured it out. So this is you now trying to sabotage what he had created. What they should have done was allowed him to continue doing what he was doing and find his way. And if he found out that this is something that he didn't want to do, he could do that on his own terms. And he could just go back to college anytime he wanted to. But you literally sabotaged a great opportunity for him and also probably ruined the rapport. And there's no way he can now go back and then do what he was doing before. Now, what I'm about to talk about with y'all is the main thing that made me say, oh, hell no. This bitch is definitely the villain. Episode 25 of season 5. For whom the wedding bells toll. Told you everything that you need to know about Vi and who she is. Vi literally slept with the father of the person who Will was going to spend the rest of his damn life with. You can't tell me that's not, number one, selfish, and number two, her sabotaging the success of her son, as I had mentioned earlier. Why would she sleep with the fiance, soon to be wife's father of her son, therefore confusing that dynamic and making it where now it was going to be awkward? And then she took it a step further, because what she did was she married the man. This now made Will the brother of the woman he was just about to spend the rest of his life with. And I get it. Some of y'all are going to say that they probably wouldn't have gotten married anyway. But here's the thing. That didn't mean that the relationship was totally over. Maybe they rushed into it too fast and they needed more time. But the one thing that his mama should not have done was then said, you know what, I'm going to go ahead on a whim and get married to a man who I was just fighting with on a plane because we had a night of passion and we ended up having sex. But this man happened to be the father of the person that her son was going to literally spend the rest of his life with. And the reason why this is so crucial is because Will literally had presented himself as somebody who was not taking women seriously. He always had these random catchphrases that he would throw at women, and he would try to holler at them all crazy and all this other stuff. But this is the one woman that he took seriously. And again, I understand that they weren't ready and they knew they weren't ready. But what his mother did not have to do, which probably hurt the situation even more, was sleep with the dad and also marry him afterwards. And you know the messed up thing about that going forward? The messed up thing is that in season 6, we ain't even see him. So it's not even clear as to whether or not she was even still married to him. And they weren't parading around this relationship even when they did show Vi later down the line. So what this basically says is that Vi, once again, is a poor decision maker, because why would you choose of all people this man who literally is the father of the person your son was going to spend the rest of his life with? And yes, I have to keep saying this over and over and over again because this was glazed over like everything that she did. And you know what's messed up about that too? And I don't want to hear the argument that, oh, it was, maybe it was some time passed. Maybe she grew. Clearly she didn't, because he's a shitty decision maker. But she passed up on a dude who was a construction worker, who was kind, intelligent, loving, caring, and what seemed like a responsible father, who was about to have his own business because she wasn't ready, only to be overly ready to marry a man who she is only marrying because they had sex and it most likely was good. And it was just before they were bickering and arguing and fighting. You can't tell me that that's not the very definition of shitty decision maker. One of the things that I also wanted to highlight about how trife Vi was is the fact that with all this being said, we have to go back to the spotlight of what was put on Lou Smith. Yes, he did abandon Will. Yes, he didn't raise him. And yes, he should be held accountable. And as a result, you could say that he is a villain. However, everything that he did, it seems that Vi also did in some way as well, or more. Think about it, y'all. Remember when Uncle Phil was having a speech with Lou when he was about to leave Will again after just randomly coming back in his life? Did Vi not do all the same things? Vi just randomly visits. And then she leaves and goes back to her life and is wishy-washy about it. Sometimes she wants Will in it, sometimes she doesn't. And then he gave a speech to Lou saying, Will is not a coat that you can just pick up when you want to. He's not supposed to be there for you. You're supposed to be there for him. But is that not what Vi was doing as well too? Was Vi not picking him up when she found convenient and then putting him away when she found convenient as well too? Or disregarding his feelings or whatever? Like, was she not doing the same thing? Now, I know some people are going to say, well, he wasn't there, period. And it had been 14 years and all this other stuff, right? But she literally sent her son to go live with his aunt and uncle, right? So that shows you that Vi had a certain mentality. Vi was somebody who was manipulative. Vi was somebody who was present but sabotaging what her son was building for her own gain and for her own desires, often which were done on a whim, not even in seriousness, but because they were things that she wanted right now and she was demanding that people gave to her. And you could see this kind of demanding attitude in everything that she was doing throughout this series, to the point where they were making it a big spectacle. Hell, and even in the episode where she was asking Will or telling Will that he needed to come back to Philly, when she was having the conversation with her sister, she was crashing out when they were basically talking about, well, you need to look at what Will wants and all this other stuff. And she was talking about how she didn't really need their opinion and all this other stuff. And she even was reasserting over and over again that this was something that they both had agreed on, but it was clear that Will had second thoughts about wanting to go live with his mother. So you can kind of see the selfishness even in her own personality. Yes, you could say that the father should be present, but also remember that the mother, just because the mother was present doesn't necessarily mean that she was doing a good job or doing the job and the things that she was supposed to do. It doesn't mean that there weren't issues on her end as well too. A mother who's present but toxic can be just as harmful, if not more, than a father who wasn't present whatsoever. The other thing too that we really need to dig into is what really happened between Vi and Lou. Was one of the reasons why he decided not to be in Will's life because of the fact that Vi was a trip? He knew how Vi was. Was it her attitude? Was it her temperament? I'm not excusing not being in your child's life, but I'm just saying we need to shine a light on Vi and look at that personality and look at what led to this becoming a thing. Because ultimately we saw that he was full of excuses. So something probably went down that made him not want to be a part of Will's life. Although it's not justified, it's something that still needs to be considered. And let's just say that Lou was totally trash and he was as bad as he was made to seem. This goes back to Vi being a terrible decision maker because she can't make proper decisions when it comes to the men that she lets into her life. She lets shitty men who ain't about nothing bust up in her and produce a kid. She lets men who come into her life who are great, she lets them go because of the fact that she's not ready to be with them. She lets men who she argues and fusses and fights with in inappropriate relationships get married to her, despite the fact that, again, this is somebody who your son, this is the father of someone who your son was going to spend the rest of his life with. You can see a pattern of her not doing well when it comes to choosing the right men to have these major life changes with. Also, another thing that this shows, and this is a common trend that I tend to see when it comes to the Shea Butter Mama class, is that they tend to lack boundaries. They tend to do things to their offspring because of the vision that they have for them, not because of what's actually best for them and what they want. This is why his mom sabotaged his job, and she also sabotaged his potential marriage as well too, or maybe a marriage that could have been a later marriage. And so I say all this to say she does this because what's most important is that she has the things that she wants in that moment. So what a lot of these Shea Butter Mamas will do is they will impede boundaries because they want things to happen so bad. And they use this moniker of being the mama as a rationale as to why people should listen to them. The only episode where I kind of could rock with what she was saying a little bit was in season 2, episode 6, where that was called. The only episode where I could somewhat rock with her was in season 2, episode 6, which was called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And in that episode, that's when her sister Janice was getting married to a white man. The points that she actually made a lot of sense. You know, it's really important with us as Black people to choose partners who are going to be able to relate to us culturally. And that's why it's important for us to kind of look at when you have these interracial relationships, because a lot of times they end up being a thing where it's either a fetish or it's a thing where, you know, something happens to that Black person who's in that relationship. Not all the time, of course, but it does happen, you know, enough where it gets attention and notoriety, and there is a pattern of this going on, right? So she was bringing up, you know, all of these different things, and they made her to seem like she was a villain. And she actually had a good point, in my opinion, despite the fact that, you know, they were trying to make it seem like she was wrong. But all in all, the point that I'm trying to make with all this is that Vi is an absolute trash character, an absolute trash mother, and is definitely the villain of this series. And the reason why I say that is because ultimately people don't want to admit the truth when it comes to who Vi Smith really was. Vi Smith was nothing more than a trifling, toxic, aged out hood rat who only got respect because of her age and her status as a mother. And that's one thing that we've got to stop doing, giving people respect just because they become a mother and they open up their legs and some dusty Negro shoots up in them, and all of a sudden there's someone who's honored as a person who sacrificed all of this different stuff when they're nothing but a selfish broad who is the problem for other people and ultimately society as a whole. All right, y'all, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed what I had to say, and I'll definitely have more to come, so make sure you stay tuned. In the meantime, I would love it if you like this video, subscribed, hit the like button and the share button and the bell icon so you get notifications for whenever I come out with new content on this channel. Other than that, I will talk to y'all later. Peace out, y'all.